Welcome to the Optimistic Curmudgeon, where the best ideas win. I'm your host, Josh Herring. Season 8 is all about the re-enchanting Inklings. How do we rebuild, renew, and restore culture? The Inklings give us a model. I want to ask for your help in two ways. You're probably watching this episode on X or on YouTube. Please find and follow us on both platforms. I tweet as @TheOptimisticC3, and then if you're looking for the show on YouTube, just search for The Optimistic Curmudgeon. We want you to be able to find and follow our content and then be able to share that across your platforms. We want to be part of the conversation and help other people to see how life is truly good, true, and beautiful. And now, on to this week's episode of The Optimistic Curmudgeon. I'm your host, Josh Herring. Today, my guest is Annie Crawford. Annie just wrapped up teaching a course with the Symbolic World. She's a regular at my favorite conferences and is quickly becoming a recognized expert at reading text symbolically. Today, we're going to be discussing C.S. Lewis's The Silver Chair and Annie's 2018 article, Finding Faith in Fairy Tales, Answers for Modern Skeptics from C.S. Lewis's The Silver Chair. Annie, welcome back to the show.
Thanks, Josh. It's great to see you. I always enjoy talking with you so much. So thanks for inviting me. I can't believe that article is 2018. Gosh, that's so long
Right?
ago.
I know. I was just going back digging through files for an article for a friend. I was like, oh. And I had comments on it from an old professor from 2019 that I still had not addressed. And I thought it was so funny. Like, okay, good. Well, 6 years later, I can fix these comments. Like, good. I'm glad he left those things in there.
There were a few, going back and reading it was really fun because Silver Chair is, I think, almost my favorite Narnia book. It's so well crafted. But looking over a couple of those sentences, I was like, oh, I think I have become a better writer because could I get back into the website and just smooth out this prose a little bit for everyone? That'd be great.
Well, it's possible Annie Nardoni is listening in today. So if so, Annie, you know that Annie Crawford wants to go in and edit that thing, but y'all can sort that out. Well, Annie, before we get into all of it, any other projects you have in the works that we should know about that people might be interested in? I feel like you always have lots going on.
Yes, well, which is why I've just ended my teaching semester and I'm feeling a little burnt out and needing to take a deep breath, but I do have a project coming up. I'm going to be working on a chapter for a book on Till We Have Faces. So I'll post that on the socials when more information comes out. So, and then, yes, I know I have several other things coming up this summer, but right now I am just ready to take a week vacay at least.
At least, and well, just as long as you don't find yourself stuck on stuck in Paris, suddenly pulled into a bacchanal facade, I mean, that would be unfortunate. But pretty much anything else would be a great vacation. So, for our listeners, that was a callback to our last conversation on the Optimistic Curmudgeon. Annie and I did a symbolic reading of the Paris. What do we end up calling that? Blue Bacchus thing? Like
their tableau, their Last Supper
that's the
tableau.
word I'm looking for. Yes, the tableau. Mm-hmm. All right. Well, let's get into a bit about your article. I want to kind of set it up this way. Why does it matter that Christians should be able to respond to skeptical concerns and questions? Why is that significant?
Yeah, good question. So I titled this article, Finding Faith in Fairy Tales, Lewis's Answer to Modern Skeptics from the Silver Chair. So, why not just have faith? Why respond to skeptics, especially like in our social media world? I mean, the skeptics on Twitter and Facebook can be rather aggressive and frustrating, and it feels like throwing pearls before swine, right? So why stick with Christian apologetics? I think two main reasons: to love Christ and to love others, right? Because Christ, whom we serve, told us that he is the way, the truth, and the life. And so people who would, by serving Christ, we are serving he who is the truth. So showing Christ as true, showing all truth as belonging to Christ, the Logos, is part of how we serve him and we glorify him. And Christ himself told us to love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, and all your mind. He gave us minds so we could use them. Paul tells us to take all of thoughts capture to Christ, who is the truth. So caring about truth, winsomely, with as much love and excellence as we can is part of our Christian vocation and part of our Christian calling. And then therefore, it's also how we love others. Other people were given minds so they could use them, so they could come to find, so they could seek and find the one who is truth. As Aristotle told us, all men desire to know. So, and as this, I think it's in Proverbs. Is it in Proverbs where it says the glory of God, it's the glory of God to conceal a matter and the
Yes.
glory of kings to search it
Seek
out.
it
So,
out.
right. So the search for truth is part of the adventure of life. It's part of the great romance, the romance of the mind, right? To quest for Christ, our King, is part of what it means to be human. And so we love others by taking their questions seriously, by wrestling with ideas with them. So, very much this is at the center of my vocation of, pursuing he who is truth and inviting others alongside me the very best that I can. So it matters a lot, Josh, matters a lot.
No, it really does. I love that. I love your passion and gift in articulating that. I come from a Southern Baptist tradition where we have simultaneously plenty of very intelligent, theologically minded Baptists, but we're never too far away from our anti-intellectual strains that ran straight through the 19th century. So I wanted to start there because it's possible that we have folks listening in who are like, why does this even matter? Why should we care about skeptics? I mean, I think obviously as Christians, we always have a spiritual, pastoral, evangelical concern for the lost. But when we're thinking about the skeptic, we're thinking particularly about people who are usually more logically inclined. They're attuned to some sort of rationality. And as you were describing that, I was thinking of two people who both kind of took a little bit of not quite Pascal's wager, but they took a bit of a bet. I mean, the bet is one that a lot of Christians have made over the years. Just look at Jesus. Go explore Jesus. And if you do, Jesus will overcome your skepticism and your dispute. I'm thinking Josh McDowell took that, and that was famously the beginning of his story, More Than a Carpenter. He spent several years just investigating all the truth claims of Christianity, the prophecies that are fulfilled from Old to New Testament, and he just couldn't escape the evidence. And then the same thing happened 2 generations later with Lee Strobel. It's just literally the same story. So I think there's something really powerful about the fact that as Christians, we do maintain we have the truth, but we also we don't need to back away from an intellectual fight. Sometimes there's this air of the atheist, like, oh, you silly Christians. How could you possibly believe such a foolish idea? And we actually do have all the resources needed, not to obliterate someone else's mind. That's not what we're trying to do. But we can articulate a reason for the hope that lies within us. And I think that does belong to part of Christian discipleship. And I just love the fact that you kind of took us to some unexpected places that's happening in the silver chair. Some of these I'd thought about before, but you had some insights that were new to me in this article.
Oh, fun. Great. Well, where do you want to go next with unpacking it?
Well, I kind of want to start I'm going to follow the kind of the outline that you did in your article. And, but that's going to take us to Dr. Michael Ward's thesis, who is, I've already released his episode in season 8 this season. But his thesis, walk us through what he does. What does he see going on in Narnia in particular? And what's going on with this word donegality?
Yes, it's a great word, isn't it? Yeah. And I think, the proof of a thesis is if it really opens up new levels of understanding to a story. And I really think Michael Ward's Planet Narnia thesis, especially in the silver chair, opens up new layers of meaning, that once you see them, you can't unsee them. They're so saturated through the details and the structure of the story that you're not projecting them onto the story, that they're really resonant with the whole of the story. So Michael Ward's Planet Narnia thesis basically is that when Lewis went to write the Chronicles of Narnia, any artist has to have some kind of unifying theme or idea that will give a coherence to the story, And Ward points out that Lewis, in his own literary criticism, says, the real power of romance, and Lewis loved romance. And by romance, we don't mean a story about a man and a woman who hook up or fall in love, but a story about like the adventure of life within a somewhat, I don't want to say magical, but meaningful world, a world that is greater than the sum of its parts, a world that has some kind of, that's saturated with, well, Lewis himself says, that contains a cryptic, significant voice, world that's full of voices and the mystery of life. So adventure within the context of a world sort of saturated with meaning and magic. That's a romance. And Lewis loved romance. It's part of why he was a medieval critic. So, and he says, actually in a book, I know you're interested in Lewis's work on Spencer. So in his book, Spencer's Images of Life, he says that, why we go back to romances, in Lewis's opinion, what he really loved about the genre of romance is that the great romance will have a taste, a kind of atmosphere that you want to experience. So yes, you already know what happens, let's say in the story of Beowulf, but you go read Beowulf because you want to taste and participate in the world, the ethos, the mythos of Beowulf. And Lewis says, you want to go to Donegal so you can experience its donegality. Or you want to go to London because you want to experience Londonness, this sort of spirit or atmosphere that is greater than the sum of its parts. So Michael Ward took that word donegality, you go to Donegal for its donegality, and he coined that as a way of describing this characteristic of a story, of a romance story, that I want to go to. Let's see, what would be another romance story? Does Jane Austen count as a romance? I don't know.
I mean, all of my students would insist that, yes, it must be, particularly Pride and Prejudice must be a romance, but they're not thinking of the definition you just gave. They're thinking of the best version of boy meets girl. They eventually fall in love. But I think my students would string me up if I said Jane Austen was not a romanticist.
Right. I know. And there's overlap because, central to the adventure of our meaningful world is the relationship between man and woman. I mean, marriage is the ultimate adventure, within this world. So there's naturally a connection between, the knight on his romantic adventure to slay the dragon in order to, wed the princess. So there's a natural connection there. But, when I go to read Pride and Prejudice again and again and again, it's because I want to experience her world, that the Regency world, this world of excellence and beauty and manners, and that is kind of something greater than the sum of its parts, that I want to go inhabit that place. So that's what Lewis really loved in a good book. And in this passage from Spencer, Life and Images, not in that book. In his famous essay on Hamlet, he says that the success of Hamlet as a story is its, we'll use the word donegality, or its atmospheric quality, that through all the images and parts of the story, Shakespeare really succeeds in taking us to what Lewis calls, quote, a certain spiritual region. And Hamlet is of interest because in The Silver Chair, Lewis is careful to tell us that the Prince Rilian looked a little bit like Hamlet. He was all dressed in black. And so Lewis is making a thematic connection between Hamlet and what he's wanting to do in The Silver Chair. And Lewis sees, what is the spiritual region, the atmosphere, the donegality that the play Hamlet takes us to. For Lewis, it's the crisis of modernity. Hamlet, where does he go to school? Where is he coming back from? From Wittenberg, which is the seedbed of the Protestant Reformation, a school known for teaching its nominalism. And so how Lewis sees Hamlet is this play of uncertainty and ambiguity unleashed on Renaissance, England, because of the crisis of authority that nominalism and the Protestant Reformation have unfurled. So here's Hamlet, this prince who is in who has to make a decision, but he lives in a world of unleashed uncertainties and ambiguities. Here he is a Protestant who's perceiving a ghost from purgatory. How does he know what's real? There's a breakdown of language where what is and what seems and what is and what people say, there's this break between the levels of his world, and he's caught in between and he can't tell what's true. And when he can't tell what's true, he doesn't know what to do. And so this is going to be a similar theme that we find in The Silver Chair, where the characters are caught in a space of ambiguity and things aren't what they seem, and they can't quite tell what's true or what's real. How do we handle, and it's very much a world like ours, we have the meaning crisis and the postmodern epistemological crisis. How do we know what is truth? How do we know what words even mean? We're caught in this space in between. How do we answer? How do we respond to such a world? And that's what this little children's fairy tale is really all about. So donegality, is about the atmospheric quality. And what Lewis did, to bring this back to Planet Narnia, is use the medieval symbolism of the 7 planets, the 7 heavens, to create the donegality or the thematic atmosphere of each of his chronicles of Narnia, each of his Narnian tales. And I really think you see it most clearly in The Silver Chair. I think The Silver Chair is kind of one of the easiest donegalities to perceive, largely because it's shaped by the moon. It's the lunar book. It's the book that is united by the imagery or symbolism of Luna. And that symbolism is, I think, easy for us to perceive because we all still see the moon. It's such a large object in the sky that captures our attention. And the characteristics of the moon are pretty prominent and obvious. The moon moves where the stars stay pretty fixed in their orbit, right? The moon moves all over the sky every 28 days, and the moon changes its shape every 28 days, being big and bright and full of white light to waning and fading and even becoming dark and invisible. So all these qualities of the moon are pretty prominent. And then therefore, it's easier for us moderns to perceive that the moon symbolizes change and wandering, that those being the kind of key symbols that are developed within a lunar donegality. Okay, so I kind of threw a lot at you there. Donegality, that atmospheric quality, how that's captured in Hamlet in a spirit of modernism, and how then Lewis is going to connect that in The Silver Chair to the kind of symbolism of the moon.
So a couple follow-up things there on the Hamlet connection. I think that is just so interesting, in part because it's been a few years. Well, it's been a few years since I've taught these in a middle school setting. I just finished rereading these in a college setting, and reading them in a college setting, we read them so fast. I assigned 1 chronicle per class period, so we didn't stay long enough really on any of them. But I do sometimes find myself looking at these things. If I were teaching the Chronicles of Narnia, I want to make sure I have plenty of other things to point people to that go beyond just what the text itself says. Yeah. That's a necessary beginning point, but it's not a sufficient end of understanding. I think being able to look at Hamlet, which is widely read in high schools still in the United States, even in public school settings, that's a great connection point, because I think students can resonate with Rillian, who there's some family drama with Rillian. It's not quite his father who's dead with his uncle, but it is his mother who's dead, and he's mistakenly gone off with the wrong woman. And there is all kinds of questions. I'd never quite noticed the nominalistic connection there, but that's all over Hamlet. And and even the foggy atmosphere is, as it's I think I've seen it staged twice, and it usually has kind of a foggy northern. We're in Denmark, obviously, spot. The other thing I want to add to the lunar piece, that this is the part that I suspect our audience doesn't know as much if they haven't read Ward or aren't like deeply steeped in medieval or ancient astrology. But from Aristotle and Ptolemy forward, So roughly the 400s AD forward, the general belief was that the moon served as a boundary. Authors would talk about beyond the lunar sphere, the sublunary space, and really the moon was this boundary that I thought you drew that part out very effectively. That like this is why in the silver chair, Jill gets her instructions on Aslan's mountain. Now, Lewis is obviously, I think by this point, he's already kind of working with a 7-book structure and he's looking ahead to what he's going to do in the last battle. But it's also worth noting that he's tapping into this whole clarity happens on the mountaintop, but the adventure does not happen on the mountaintop. And the further the kids go down in the valley and in their journey, the harder it is for them to perceive the voice of Aslan. And they're now below the moon. They're in this sublunary space. And Lewis in general is going to use that in the Ransom trilogy as sort of the division point between our world, Thulkandra, that's set apart in the fields of Arbol from literally the entirety of the cosmos that is united in this great dance before Mal-Eldil. The moon is the barrier there. And so he's also playing with that here in the silver chair, which is just really, really fun once you're looking for it.
Yes, it's so fun. Yes. So, and you can see how that this meaning comes from people's observation of the world, right? So you're a pre-modern person who spends a lot of time outside looking at the stars, and you notice that the stars are fixed in their sphere and they always shine in the same places. And so, yeah, for the Ptolemaic imagination, the heavens were the eternal realm, the realm of perfection. This is why Aristotle thought they must move in circles, not, because that's the perfect shape. And this is the realm of unchanging, eternal perfection. But then you look at the moon is changing. And so it must be that beyond the moon is the place of eternal fixed identities, clarity, light. Beneath the moon is where change happens, because we see the moon changing. And so the sublunary space is the realm of change. But the problem with change is that change creates ambiguity. Change creates uncertainty. As I go from an acorn to a tree, at what point is that change from one identity to another fully developed? And so the influence of the moon with its changeableness, its ambiguity, its confusion, at what point is it fully a full moon? You'll ever ask yourself that? You're on a walk, is tonight the full moon? Because you're not quite sure.
Not quite sure, yeah.
Right? And so the influence of this ambiguity, this uncertainty, this change, an undue influence or an excess of influence led people to be lunatics. So luna is the Latin name for the moon, and that's where we get lunacy and a lunatic, someone who is overly influenced by the confusion and change, so that a lunatic, their connection to reality breaks. They don't know who they are. They don't know what's real or what's unreal. Hamlet himself goes through a stage of lunacy, and we're not quite sure whether he's actually crazy or not. Whether, we experience his uncertainty by being uncertain whether he's feigning his lunacy or whether he's actually fallen into it. And so Lewis picks up on that with Rillian, who under the witch's spell is dragged down to the furthest depths, away from the heavens, the space of perfection and clarity and knowledge, down into the depths in a space where he is a lunatic. He doesn't know who he is most of the day. He doesn't know what reality is. And so you see that excess of lunar influence at the polar opposite narratively of Aslan's country, where there's clarity and knowledge. And I just want to point out, because this is, I think, so brilliant, he also maps Plato's cave analogy onto this lunar structure, right? So in Plato's cave, for a little reminder, we'll start with the inverse order of Plato's cave. Plato's cave has the land where the sun shines outside is his metaphor for the realm of the forms and the truth. The sun which is the good, the source of being and light and knowledge, shines on things, giving them their true form. And so this sunlit land for Plato is the realm of perfect being and form and knowledge. But we are stuck down here in the cave of appearances. And so in the cave, though, there's two different parts within the cave, actually, right? Because you have at the very bottom of the cave, the prisoners who are chained to the wall being shown shadows. And then just a little bit above that, you have the people who are manipulating the shadows. So within the cave, you actually have a two-part structure. Those who manipulate images in order to chain people to, shadows of truth. So you see that within the silver chair, if you have Aslan's country, where there's the sunlit lands above, and then they go down into the first layer, which is just Narnia, where there is some amount of confusion. The prince is lost, and Aslan tells Jill, as you descend, it will be harder for you to perceive what is true. You will start to enter into ambiguities and confusions. But as they journey to quest for the prince, they go down a whole nother level, which would be like the inner cave of Plato's analogy, where the witch herself is using technology and technique in order to manipulate images so that she can control the perceptions, right, of Prince Rilian and then Jill. And so I just thought it's so interesting that it's not just that Lewis has the heavens and then the sublunar, but that he takes it a sublunar, right, that makes the whole structure and analogous to Plato's cave analogy in pretty brilliant ways.
With even a further deepening with the unexplored land abysm that kind of takes the Plato's cave analogy and then says, now, wait a minute, these prisoners in the cave were themselves falsely imprisoned here, and they rightly belong in this beautiful natural space that is sublunar. And it just keeps building in complexity. One of the things that amazes me, even with the that level of ambiguity, I think you see that so clearly with Jill and the signs. And but the signs in a way are Aslan. I mean, they're obviously Aslan's guidance, but they're the tool that, like, Aslan knows that Jill's going to be confused. He knows how they're going to do this, but those signs are ambiguously worded. The kids can never quite predict how they're I mean, they don't know how any of them are going to be fulfilled ahead of time. I think that's another interesting spot for the ambiguity there.
And is reflective of the way Christ speaks to us, right? Like, Lord, teacher, why do you speak in these parables and these symbols? Like, can you speak plainly?
Like, I love reading those sections of the Gospels where the apostles clearly don't get it. And thinking, how much more does but Jesus is so patient with them, but they don't get it. And even when Jesus says, y'all don't get this, I speak to the crowds in parables, but I thought y'all understood this. And that it's like I don't know, he's like the teacher with the slow class, and then he has to explain it again and again and again.
But that there's a purpose to that. So like I said earlier, it's the glory of God to conceal a matter and the glory of kings to search it out. And that God has made this life to be an adventure, to be a great quest for his glory and our delight. And so it's not just, so the fact that Aslan speaks, in symbols, let's say, or in slightly ambiguous ways, and that Christ speaks in parables, has a pedagogical purpose, right? We're both teachers. We know that if we just give the students the answer, we rob them of the adventure of learning, of the formation of their souls and their own affections that happens through the wrestling in order to find it out, right? Yeah. And so I think, that's one reason why I love fairy tales, I'll say, is because it helps me experience this world as an adventure, and not to be frustrated with God that he doesn't speak more plainly, but to trust him as I trust a great author to be leading me on an adventure that in the end will result in, in delight, sanctification, joy, treasures that could not be obtained if he just straight out gave us the answers and collapsed the adventure, before it had even begun.
Well, that's a great transition to kind of the second half of your article. You shift into more specifically. So we've set the stage with kind of Hamlet and the ambiguities of modernity, and then you raise this concern of skepticism, and then we'll go to that great scene in a moment with the queen, with the green lady, the green lady, the lady of the green kirtle, and Prince Aurelian, and Puddleglum, the burnt marshwiggle, and all those things. But why is skepticism appealing in the modern world? Like, what is it about modernity that lends itself to fostering the skeptic?
Yeah. And I love that Lewis appreciated the role of the skeptic. You see it in several of his writings. And it makes sense because in a world of ambiguity and uncertainty, where it's not clear what is and what isn't, and who someone is and who someone isn't, skepticism is actually a very normal, healthy, rational response to uncertainty. Well, when I'm not sure, I need to question and doubt so that I'm not taken in by a deception, such as the lady of the green kirtle, right? And so skepticism has its role. And Lewis, his own great teacher, the great Knock, was a skeptic. I think that's where Lewis really learned to appreciate the role. He makes McPhee in the Ransom trilogy. He says it's a really important role. You need your skeptic, right, who helps you test. Be like the Bereans in Scripture, right? Test in order to know whether something's certain. It's a necessary skill within a fallen world, whereas Aquinas says we're born into sin and ignorance. And so we're going to have some measure of skepticism. The problem with skepticism is when it becomes itself an idol, like anything, right? When I doubt everything, and then therefore I'm able to believe nothing. So it's a good tool to keep us from deception, but it's a bad tool when it keeps us from truth. Like a sword, it can be used to cut away bad things, cancers and enemies and weeds, but like a sword, it could also just destroy everything, right? And I love Puddleglum. So Puddleglum plays the role of the skeptic. He's such a such a great character.
He really is. Such a great character. I have to bring in that Michael Ward decided when I interviewed him on the show this season, he brought up the fact that apparently the Puddleglum ought to be the spirit animal for the optimistic curmudgeon. And I just thought that was perfect.
I love it, right? A good-hearted skeptic. It keeps us from falling into error. But then the good-hearted, right? I think, and the key, and I think you see this in Puddleglum, is you have to be willing to doubt your own doubt, to be skeptical of your own skepticism, to be skeptical of skepticism so that you know its limits and don't get caught, and don't let your skepticism destroy any ability to move into truth. So, and you see, Puddleglum, one way that he's skeptical in this very, I feel like, warm-hearted way is that he says, I'm sure your beds were very hard and you didn't sleep well. And the children are like, no, they were soft and they were great. I'm sure you won't like the eel. It'll taste terrible. They're like, no, actually, it was very tasty and very good. And so this kind of skepticism that questions whether something's actually good or not prepares him for the worst in a way that gives him, fortitude and perseverance. And he says, I always like to, what does he say? I always like to see the worst of things, but then put a good face on it, right? Yes. Be prepared for the worst, but kind of hope for the best, which I think is just a healthy attitude for the skeptic. So I appreciate Lewis's, even though he in our modern world, skepticism has led us to nihilism because we idolized its role and didn't recognize its limits. And so Lewis wants to answer skeptics, and yet this is very characteristic of Lewis. He has sympathy with them. Hey, in a world of ignorance and sin and confusion and epistemological crisis, of course you experience skepticism. But it's good, but let's make sure we're asking good questions, because good questions lead to good answers. Let's make sure we're not cutting ourselves off from finding any ground to stand on in our skepticism. So he shows both a sympathy and, as we get to that climactic scene, I think some really excellent answers.
Yeah, Lewis is I think he's definitely playing on the fact that in modern world, we lack certainty that previous generations had. Previous generations just kind of accepted the biblical creation narrative as just like, that is what it is. Post 1861 or so, like, that's no longer nearly as certain in that way. Prior to Descartes, the philosophical assumption was that I can trust my senses. And there might be a few crazy people out there, but by the time you get to the 18th century, post Descartes and post Hume, there's a rich literature saying, actually, we cannot be sure that anything our senses reveal to us is certain.
Yeah.
And that gives rise to this whole other question. But then you've even got the scientific revolution, where so many different narratives of what we knew for sure were wrong. And then the new explanation is also wrong, as proven later on. So we get these modern conditions that don't really lend themselves towards certainty. But then we get to that great scene. So I'm going to describe the scene, and then I just want to, Annie, I want to know what you see in this. But go ahead.
And let me just add something before we get to the scene, because I think the switch that happened, and I was talking to someone about this the other day, is in the pre-modern world, we were looking for truth and knowledge. The modern world starts looking for certainty. That is a different word with different implications. And one thing I'm always interested in, I think we really underestimate, is the power that mediums have to shape our epistemology, right? So I'm very, very interested and write and think and read a lot about oral cultures and what the communication of knowledge through oral mediums, how that shapes our understanding. Then you go to a written culture, right? Well, the move to a print culture pushed us into a desire for certainty that previous cultures and media had not pushed us for. That everybody, because the print medium has values exactitude. I'm able to create many copies with an exact mechanical replication. And that begins to push the modern person to look for that kind of certainty in our knowledge. And what so that is why I think plays a huge role in what we're having to reckon with now, is that we don't get certainty, but that doesn't mean we can't have knowledge, reliable knowledge that we can build a life on. Okay. And I think, in a sense, certainty is actually, the original sin was to grasp for the tree of knowledge of good and evil, a knowledge that was not appropriate to who we were at that time, right? So to grasp at knowledge that is beyond what is appropriate to the kind of creature a human is. And so I think that's the whole modern era of our skepticism and of our uncertainty came for grasping at a type of knowledge, a certainty that was not actually appropriate to the kind of creatures and the kind of knowledge that we have. But the fact that we can't have godlike omniscient certainty doesn't entail we can't have reliable knowledge sufficient to build a life on, if that makes sense.
No, I think it makes perfect sense. And it actually is a great segue to the Lady of the Green Kirtle, the Queen of Underworld. She has returned from her journey to find Prince Rillian freed from the silver chair. He has hacked the chair into pieces with his sword. And she comes in and begins speaking to the children. And they don't quite realize it, but she's practicing her arts of enchantment upon them. She's strumming her lyre, and she's put some incense to burn in the fireplace. and their minds aren't like gone, but they're definitely softened through the senses. And then she starts talking to them, and over the course of probably 4 or 5 pages, she makes several suggestions that, in fact, the world above does not exist. The sun is nothing but an overgrown lamp. Aslan is nothing but a big cat. And ultimately, the children put up a good fight. Rillian kind of puts up a fight, but it's really Puddleglum who keeps the initial skeptic is the one who is not willing to go to this pernicious skepticism. And he gives this great speech that I'll read in a moment after you walk us through some more detail. But this great speech where he really determines that he will live like a Narnian even if there is no Narnia. So Annie, unpack this scene for us. Kind of what arguments is Lewis speaking to, and where is he kind of addressing these theistic claims in the packaging of a fairy tale?
Yes, I think the most helpful way to think about this is we've descended from that heavenly sphere of clarity into increasing levels of confusion, ambiguity. Jill more and more forgets the signs. They're more and more concerned with their material comfort, right? So their kind of level of consciousness is descending to more and more, I'm tired, I'm hungry, I'm cold. Their consciousness, in a sense, is sort of descending toward the earth more and more until at this one point, running for their lives, they end up in the earth. And I think this scene with the Green Lady's enchantments are a point of total inversion, where for the Christian worldview, God is the source of being, spirit, heaven is the source of being that descends and fills the earth. For the materialist, which is the view that the Green Lady is going to espouse, matter is the source of being, and things emerge from raw matter. Then life evolves and consciousness emerges. And so you have a complete inversion of reality. Excuse me, which she expresses. Oh goodness, excuse me, hold on a second.
Yep.
She expresses in language reminiscent of oh my goodness. Okay, I think I got it.
There we go.
Language reminiscent of Feuerbach, Freud, Marx, the 4 horsemen of the postmodern apocalypse, if you will, who, whereas all of Christendom would explain reality as emerging from God as a source, we're going to flip that upside down and come up with a way to explain everything as coming from matter, right? So Freud is going to give material explanations for psychological phenomenon. Feuerbach is giving material explanations for religious phenomenon. Marx is giving materialist explanations for sociological, political, economic phenomenon. And it's the world turned upside down. And so, and it also, we could see it as Plato's cave turned inside out, right? So whereas Plato says that the shadows in the cave, which for him are, material images, are really shadows of these higher realities, and the witch and Feuerbach and Marx and Freud are going to flip that upside down and say, no, these spiritual realities, Aslan, in the story, Aslan stands for God. Those are imaginative dreams or projections of material things you experience down here in the cave. And so the Green Lady flips this. So just let me summarize, try and be clear. Whereas from a Christian Platonic view, God is the source of light, analogous to the sun. And then our lamp is our own sub-creation that participates, that's an imitation of the sun. And the Green Lady flips that upside down and says, no, you've only dreamed of God and dreamed of the sun, The reality, the real thing is that which you can touch, taste, measure right here, right now. That's what's real. These other things above, those are dreams. Those are wish fulfillments. Those are imaginative projections. And she uses the technique of, I just think this is so interesting, technology and technique. And if you go back to the Genesis story, you know, the inventor of instruments and music is Jubal, a son of Cain. And it's first used in Genesis in service of, you know, the creation of the evil cities. And so she's using this technique and this technology in order to remove their senses from an immediate perception of reality around them, to help to cause them to internalize their consciousness even more, to withdraw to where her deception can feel like a truth. So the Green Lady has inverted the whole world, flips it upside down, and parroted the arguments of men like Feuerbach, Freud, and Marx. And you know why? Because I think this is one thing that modern skepticism, you know, I sometimes sympathize with the Baptist withdraw into the anti-intellectualism, because in the 19th, 20th century, the intellectual landscape was hard to deal with, because we forgot the truth. We forgot the reality that we see what we want to see. I've been reading Isaiah this month, and again, Isaiah says that you have eyes but don't see. You have ears but don't hear, because the heart, right? Watch over the well springs of your heart, for, you know, watch over your heart, for that is the wellspring of life. That we aren't purely rational creatures. That the argument, you know, we'll accept an argument when we want to accept an argument. And so to believe that finding the truth as a purely intellectual exercise is not true. We have to pay attention to the desires of our heart, to what we want to be true. And so, you know, I think when you pay attention to the Green Lady, why does she make this argument? Why does she want this to be the truth? Well, she is revealed to be, at the end of the scene, the same old serpent, the same old enemy. She wants to eradicate the ability of creation to speak the truth about God, so that she can usurp him, so that she can take control of the world. And so this is always, you know, Alexander Solzhenitsyn talked about this. The tyrant always has to lie. The tyrant always has to lie, because the world itself is proclaiming the glory of God, is telling us the truth about God, and that he is the creator and we are the creature. And that, and if we would invert, if we want to ascend to the high place, to make ourselves God, to put ourselves in control of the world, we have to find a way to blind ourselves to the meaning of things, to the glory of God that the world is always proclaiming. And so that's really the clever, brilliant trick that this Freudianism is, where if you can convince someone that the meaning you see in the world isn't real, is merely a projection, that the world is actually meaningless, then we blind ourselves to the truth about God that the world is saying, but so that the tyrant can replace, you know, that meaning with their own, which is exactly what the Green Lady does.
Oh yeah, she's trying to. She wants to. She tells us that Aurelian, before he's unenchanted, tells the kids the plan. He will lead the armies of underworld out to the surface, into Narnia, and they will take over Narnia, which is one of my. I just think it's such a fascinating. Another place where Lewis is inverting this. He's taking the rightful prince and going to have him usurp his own kingdom, enslaved to this evil witch. And it's the same kind of thing in a very real way that Jadis is doing, the White Witch in Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe. She too is creating a false nature, always winter, never Christmas, and people can kind of live in that, but they can't live with joy. And you get that too here in Underworld. Like the slaves are kind of living, but they're so happy as soon as they are freed and they start lighting off firecrackers. And there's a joyfulness in the nature when that natural rhythm is restored, even though it's still, and that the witch's fake kingdom all collapses with her own death. It can't survive her, like,
Right.
which is its own, I suppose, symbol of sterility. I mean, she doesn't have her own child that will carry on her kingdom past her. Instead, the whole thing is rigged with magic that causes this cave to collapse as soon as she's done.
That's so good. And because if we are having to make our own meaning, right? So,
which is what all
really,
of those guys you quoted are asserting, that ultimately we as humans make meaning in the world, and that rather than discovering it, which is ultimately, I think, is the most succinct way we could define modernism. It's this belief that we create the world around us using the powers of technology and science, rather than inherit, steward, discover the world that God has given us.
Right.
Yeah.
Which means as soon as I die, that all collapses. Right.
Which we could quickly get into a whole bunch of tangents about how awful modernism is. But that's part of why modernism continues to struggle with this idea of, like, why exactly should we have the next generation of people to give the world to? We reflexively do that, but we no longer understand on a cultural, civilizational, societal level that we inherit the past, we steward the past, and we transmit the past to the next generation. We're part of what Edmund Burke called the great contract between the dead, the living, and the yet to be born. Like now I want to read one passage, because we've been going kind of all over the place with this, and I really hope hopefully we have a great live stream audience that's sticking with us today. So clearly they're enjoying our discussion. But part of what I love about this scene is that Lewis agrees with you. They cannot defeat the witch on purely rational grounds. And it's So the speech I'm about to read is coming directly after Puddleglum, who, if you've not read the book, is sort of a froggy stick man. And he's got webbed toes. And it's significant here because his feet, which were webbed and hard and cold-blooded like a duck's, stamping out a fire would, quote, hurt him badly enough. But it won't hurt quite the same way it would if Eustace had done this with a bare foot. But Puddleglum has just stamped out the incense fire, and the sweet smell of sickly opioid-like, I'm kind of imagining like an opium den kind of vibe, that's replaced with burnt marshwiggle. And then Puddleglum gives the best speech in all of the Chronicles of Narnia. Here's what he says. One word, ma'am, Puddleglum said, coming back from the fire, limping because of the pain. One word. All you've been saying is quite right, I shouldn't wonder. I'm a chap who always liked to know the worst, and then put the best face I can on it. So I won't deny any of what you said. But there's one thing more to be said, even so. Suppose we have only dreamed or made up all those things, trees and grass and sun and moon and stars and Aslan himself. Suppose we have. Then all I can say is that, in that case, the made-up things seem a good deal more important than the real ones. Suppose this black pit of a kingdom of yours is the only world. Well, it strikes me as a pretty poor one. And that's a funny thing when you come to think of it. We're just babies making up a game, if you're right. But 4 babies playing a game can make a play world which licks your real world hollow. That's why I'm going to stand by the play world. I'm on Aslan's side, even if there isn't any Aslan to lead it. I'm going to live as like a Narnian as I can, even if there isn't any Narnia. So, thanking you kindly for our supper, if these 2 gentlemen and the young lady are ready, we're leaving your court at once and setting out in the dark to spend our lives looking for overland. Not that our lives will be very long, I should think, but that's small loss if the world's as dull a place as you say. I love that speech, because I think here, this I think is Lewis responding to the skeptic in a way that says, ultimately, you must affirm reality. You have to start with this premise. And even if he's wrong, he would rather affirm that reality than truly remain in the utter nihilism of unanswered skepticism. But that's not a position that you can get to by reason alone. But it's also not sufficient to just stamp out the fire and then leave everybody confused. There's this mixture of rational response that is necessary paired with a physical response that together makes a holistic answer that breaks the enchantment and then triggers a fight with a giant snake.
Yeah, right. And as in Paralandra in the Ransom trilogy, this idea that just having the truth in my head alone is not sufficient. It has to be acted out. That the victory of Christ has to not just be one that's a mental assent, but one that gets acted out in the kingdom of this world. That the serpent, you've recognized her as a liar and a deceiver. Great. You still have to get rid of her and disempower her, right? And so, yes, I mean, this whole scene deserves almost a dissertation. So as someone who has a degree in apologetics, knows, Aquinas's 5 ways, I see his 4th way in here. I see the ontological argument in here. I see Pascal's wager in here. I see Alvin Plantinga's properly basic belief in here. Lewis somehow so brilliantly pulls together in what is just a rip-roaring children's fairy tale all of these epistemological threads in a way that really is just exquisite. Argument from desire, so many places that we could go with this. Yeah, it's just a fantastic scene. And I want to back up just a little bit because before this moment, Puddleglum says, she's saying there is no Aslan. It's all a dream. There's no world but this material world. And Puddleglum says, I don't rightly know what you mean by world, but you can play that fiddle till your fingers drop and you still won't make me forget Narnia. We'll never see it again, I shouldn't wonder. You may have blotted it out and turned it all dark like this for all I know. Nothing more likely, but I know I was there once. I've seen the sky full of stars, and I've seen the sun coming out of the sea of a morning and sinking behind the mountains at night. I've seen him up in the midday sky when I couldn't look at him for brightness. Like poetry. I mean, it's just beautiful. And Puddleglum, that's kind of the witness of the faithful. I've tasted and seen. My eyes have beheld the glory and the light, and I know it. I know it. And so that just experience of truth that we have on a kind of properly basic level. I've tasted and I've seen, and I know it from the inside, right? And so in Lewis's Meditation in a Tool Shed, he talks about we have these 2 ways of knowing. We can look at things objectively from the outside, kind of through science, but we also experience things from the inside. I feel pain. I've known love. I've seen beauty. And that kind of knowledge that we experience on the inside is valid knowledge. That is valid knowledge. Now we have to test it against the other kinds of knowledge, but that doesn't mean it's not still real and a valid source of, excuse me for my voice, a valid source of understanding. So I just think that scene is also beautiful. And then that's when the witch goes, deception 2.0, second level deception, where I'm going to even cause you to doubt your own direct experiences, where this kind of Freudian skepticism, even Cartesian really, where I doubt even my own dreams because a demon could be making me perceive this from the inside out. This is just excessive skepticism, right? And then that to the answer that Puddleglum gives, which you give. And I think, I see there 2 main things going on. One is, I think, the ontological argument and then Pascal's wager. And Lewis in, I think it's an essay called Bulverism, where he's dealing with the Freudian argument, where he says, so Freud says, and he gets this from Feurbach, you believe in God because this heavenly overworld Aslan reality, because you've had an experience of a material father and you want to project a better one. Or you only believe this because you're your dad was mean to you and you need psychological comfort of projecting a higher father. And in the essay Bulverism, Lewis says, you know what, Freud, this works both ways. You had a bad father that you want to be free of, and so you project atheism. You imagine a godless world because you have psychological, emotional reasons to perceive the world that way. So this kind of, he calls it Bulverism, this Freudian argument of belief based off wish fulfillment or psychological need, applies to anything. And so in that sense, it can't settle the question. You have to settle the question some other way, because I can as easily dismiss your atheism as you can my theism on the grounds of wish fulfillment. So, and that's kind of the move I see him making with Puddleglum, like, all right, maybe you're right and it's wish fulfillment. Maybe yours is wish fulfillment. On what other grounds can I get a grasp of the truth of reality, of some kind of reality on which to stand, have a life, make my existential decision? And that's where I see Lewis connecting value to reality. That I can and this is where I see both, this would probably be more philosophical detail than your audience might want to go into, but I see both Aquinas's fourth way, an argument from degree here.
Okay.
Right? Because
run through that real quick, because I think I remember that one, but it's been a couple years since I've read Aquinas on that.
Yeah, so Aquinas's arguments are based off what we observe in reality and then inferring to a cause. Aristotelian causality is the way that he structures his arguments. And that I observe in this world that some things are better than others. Some people are stronger, some people are faster, some people are more beautiful, some people are more just. And if I experience in this world degree, you can't make sense of the world without reference to degree, that means there has to be some kind of standard by which I can measure the degree. So if some things are more beautiful than others, then there must be a formal cause of beauty, some kind of cause for that perception of degree. And so here, Puddleglum saying, well, the sun, I don't know whether the sun exists or not based on these modes of argument, but I know the sun's better than a lamp, because obviously the lamp you have to plug in and you had to make it and it's contingent, but the sun shines on its own and hangs on its own in the sky, and that's better. And if I can perceive better, then you could make an argument that it's more real, but whether it's more real or not, I'm going to choose the better. I'm going to make that Pascalian wager on what's better, because even if I'm wrong, I'll have lived better anyway. And so I think implicit in that whole argument is this argument from degree, that you really can't have the lesser things without the higher things. And whether or not I'm right, it's better to live for what's better.
Oh, there is so much happening in here. If and we've got I'm keeping an eye on our time. We got to wrap this up here in just a second. So to our live stream audience, thank you all for joining us today. If you've got any questions for Annie, go ahead and put your comments in. We'll try and take some of those before we wrap up. But put those in as comments on the video for whatever platform you're watching on, and we'll try to take those. I do think there's, just in case there's any teachers who are listening to this episode thinking, what would I do as a lesson plan? I've heard at least 3 different lesson plans in your descriptions. I mean, I could certainly look at this passage. We could spend a very good seminar looking at this passage from Puddleglum, Jill, and Eustace's perspective. Probably looking at, and I think part of what I would want to draw out from there is the fact that it's significant that Jill and Eustace don't fall prey to the witch easily or immediately, but they do. And I think there's something there. I don't know that Lewis is saying this, but certainly the story suggests this. There is something about adults and adult experience that does bring a greater awareness of evil and a greater resistance to evil when adults have lived the right lives. And they bring that wisdom to those kinds of experiences. Certainly you could look at that. You could also look at this from the witch's perspective and like the art level of like, how is she tempting? How is she deceiving? Almost a taxonomy of lies. You mentioned 2 levels there. That could be a very interesting rhetoric discussion on like, oh, well, what's she doing here? Because and then there's at least an entire philosophy lesson, if not multiple lessons. I know you mentioned a dissertation. I don't know. Maybe that'd be a dissertation that was indexing this to a lot of other places, but I mean, you certainly
We'll
could
say
get through.
master's thesis, then we'll back it up.
Yeah.
Just the
But
thesis.
but you could certainly do a really good lesson looking at the philosophical ideas that are kind of woven in here. I could almost see this being brought in at the end of a philosophy class that has surveyed some of Plato, some of Aristotle, some of Aquinas, maybe a quick unit on apologetics in like a high school Bible context. And they'd be like, okay, let's now look at this passage and see all these pieces that we've looked at almost like in play. Because when you read philosophy as pure philosophy, it's very rarely in play. It's being worked out in propositional form. But this, I think, is one of Lewis's greatest gifts. I mean, he takes certainly not all philosophical concepts, but he takes so many complex, rich philosophical concepts, and he shows those to us in action as these working images. I mean, in that sense, I think he clearly addresses the logical side with the speeches, but he also brings in the imaginative side with this whole scene and like walking us through that as the reader. Any final thoughts, comments on this passage before we wrap up today?
Yeah, going off what you just said, one thing we didn't touch on that is what made me want to write about this book in the first place is the way that Lewis, because we were talking about how we are not purely rational creatures, and beneath our skepticism is often a heart issues. We contend as fallen humans, right? I mean, my favorite verse, unfortunately, is Jeremiah 17:9, that the heart is desperately wicked and deceitful above all else. Our heart deceives us. We don't even fully understand our own hearts and our own motivations. And so often what looks like an intellectual block is actually a heart issue. And so how do we respond to that? And I think Lewis leads the way in saying we tell ourselves stories, because stories work on all these levels at once. Stories engage the mind, they engage the imagination, they engage the heart. And so one thing I love about this story is the way that Lewis leads us into an adventure with Jill and Eustace, and he creates sympathy with his characters. You know, we love Puddleglum, and we feel, you know, we like Jill and Eustace. Maybe we have various responses to them, but they feel like human children who are so much like ourselves. And so we identify with these characters and we go on adventure with them, and we want them to find the lost prince, and we don't want them to be eaten by the giants. And so our affections are really deeply engaged with these characters way before almost any reader can perceive the way that Lewis is going to bring up deep philosophical issues of modernity. I just think he's not at all obvious in this story.
Yeah.
I think, you know, once you get to that climactic scene, if you're philosophically grounded, all of a sudden you're like, oh my goodness, I see it. Yeah. But it is not at all propagandistic. It's very artistically well crafted, so that by the time we get to this crisis of modernity with these characters deep in, you know, the bottom of Plato's cave, we want the skepticism to be answered. We want to find a way to believe. And so Lewis, through the power of story, has given all of his readers, modern skeptics, most of us, you know, a desire for answers through the power of his story. And I think that is, you know, hugely important, and so much the power of what Lewis has done to make us want the truth, to make us hope that there is a truth we can stand on. That stirring up of our hearts, I think, is the most important response to the modern crisis that he's given us.
Fabulous. I can't think of a thing to add on that. So we're just going to take that as our closing note for today. Annie, where can people find and follow you online?
You can go to my website, anniecrawford.net, and I try to keep that updated. And then follow me on Facebook at Annie Crawford or on X at Annie L. Crawford. I'm most active on X because there's the most sword play and fun over there. So
That's so true.
give me a follow there.
Facebook is dead. Hopefully X stays alive. I don't know. I'm a little afraid that now that Elon, I kind of initially I was excited when Elon like took over X, and I'm a little worried that he is the dog from that movie that's like squirrel. And he went from X to Doge, and now I'm pretty sure he's going to go back to Tesla and Neuralink. But I would like for X to stay the fun place that it currently is. We'll see. You've been listening to another episode of The Optimistic Curmudgeon, where the best ideas win. I'm your host, Josh Herring. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If so, please do find and follow us on X and on YouTube. On X, you can find me as at The Optimistic C3, and on YouTube, just search for Optimistic Curmudgeon. We want to make sure that you have the ability to find and follow all of our content. And then if you're looking at the show description, you'll see links to any resources that were referenced in the show, as well as the sponsors for this episode. Please do check those out. We are very grateful for a variety of different institutions in helping to make this show possible. Until next time, seek the good, enjoy the true, and live the beautiful.